Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our October webinar in the Southern New South Wales Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub's Expanded Horizons series, which is brought to you by Charles Sturt University and supported by the Australian Government's Future Drought Fund. My name is Prue Cook, I'm from Nine Creeks Consulting, and I'm your host across the series. This webinar series is for those of us who work with farming and regional communities from policy to the paddock, and it encourages us to think differently regarding how we approach engagement, extension and adoption in Southern New South Wales and across the country more broadly, particularly concerning drought resilience, ag tech and biosecurity. Through the series, we explore novel thinking and new ideas from different sectors, industries and countries to stimulate new approaches to collaboration and building rural resilience. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wotjobaluk, Jadwa, Jadwajali, Wagaya and Japagok nations, who are the traditional custodians of the land that I'm joining you from today, and also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which each of you are joining us. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Indigenous Australians who might be present today. Let's get into today's subject. So, you've done some amazing research, or maybe you've developed a really innovative product. You've proven that it can improve farmer profitability or productivity or environmental sustainability, or maybe a combination of all three. You've conducted a great marketing campaign and you've been to heaps of field days and you've spoken to lots of farmers who seem keen, but farmers aren't adopting it, or at least not in the numbers that you need. So why is this happening and what can we do about it? To help us with this, our guest for today is Professor David Pannell. David is a Professor of Agricultural and Resource Economics at the University of Western Australia, and he's the Director of the Centre for Environmental Economics and Policy. David, I'm super excited to have you here today to talk about farmer adoption, and judging by the fact that this webinar hosts a maximum of 150 people is oversubscribed, I don't think that I'm the only one, so
Thanks
welcome.
very much, Prue.
All right, now just a quick note to our audience, welcome here today. If you've participated in one of our webinars before, the format is a fireside chat, or given how warm it is where I am today, it's probably a bit more of an air conditioner chat. We've only got a couple of slides to accentuate some of David's points, so you can listen along even if you're driving or you have other work to do in the background. David and I are going to have a chat about his work, and we invite you to ask questions or share your own experiences through the chat function at any time. You're also going to be sent a recording of this webinar after it finishes, so if you're having any technical difficulties or if you need to leave early, please don't worry. So, David, let's learn a little bit about you first, because we like to understand the person who we're talking to. Your expertise spans a lot of facets, from agriculture, conservation practices, environmental policy, and of course, farmer adoption. Can you give us a quick snapshot of what your career as an agricultural economist looks like?
Okay, yeah, sure. I started off doing a degree in agricultural science, so I started from the broader science background, and then added on agricultural economics to that. After I graduated, I worked for the state government, the Department of Agriculture here in WA, for 7 years, working on things like the economics of farming systems, risk, weeds, rotations, lots of different aspects of farming systems, largely in grain dominated areas, but a bit more broadly than that. And then in 1991, I moved to the University of Western Australia, kept doing most of those things, but broadened it out a bit and added in work on the connection between agriculture and the environment, which you sort of mentioned, and also started doing work on a farmer's adoption of new practices, which is why we're here.
Excellent. And so given that's our focus, what drew you into that area?
Well, in that work, in most of that work, there was a fair bit of farmer engagement, and I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed working with them, collaborating with them, going out to the farm and telling them the results of the analysis that we've been doing and so on. So that was priming me. And then I spent some time working in the wheat belt and got quite heavily involved in doing extension and watching a lot of extension. So that also primed me. And I was working with researchers who were very concerned about adoption, very interested in the level of adoption that they could achieve from their research. So that sort of primed me as well. And then when I moved to UWA, I got asked to join a project looking at the adoption of lupins as a new crop in Western Australia. And so I was all set to go, really. I got into that project and, haven't stopped since, really. It seems like this issue of adoption is one of massive interest to people. So it draws me back all the time. I couldn't walk away from it even if I wanted to, I think.
Excellent. And look, just stepping away from the farmer adoption for a moment there, I believe you've recently experienced a little bit of a career highlight. Can you tell us about the Journal of Beetle Studies? And when I say beetles, I mean BEATLES.
Yes. Okay. So obviously I'm a Beatles fan. You can see some of my Beatles collection behind me. And yes, so I'm fairly obsessive about the Beatles. I have lots and lots of Beatles music and books and so on, and so just very engaged with everything to do with the Beatles. And then someone told me last year that somebody had started a new research journal called the Journal of Beatles Studies, and I was aware that there was some research on the Beatles, but I had no idea how much. So I went looking. And there's heaps. There's absolutely heaps, but it was spread all over the place. It was in biology journals and economics journals and sociology journals. So someone's tapped into this and created this new journal. And I thought, as a researcher, I have to be in that journal. So I decided that I would try and do some quantitative research, and I did that and focused on the Beatles' official releases while they were together in the 60s, and submitted that, and it got accepted. It's just come out just in the last little while, so it's incredibly exciting.
Excellent. So what do you think there's more of, Beatles research or farmer adoption research?
Farmer adoption. There are thousands of studies on farmer adoption. There are more people that read the Beatles research because there are so many Beatles fans, but there are more people doing the research on adoption.
Okay, I think there's a bit of a problem in that. Now, and welcome, we've got a lovely international contingent joining us in the comments section today, so welcome to everybody who's joining in. So we always like to kick off these webinars with a little bit of a 101 to go over some basic terminology and concepts, particularly recognising that we've often got a lot of new practitioners in our midst. So let's start by looking at the different stages a farmer goes through when they're adopting a new practice or innovation. Obviously, they don't hear about something and then it's done. What's the pathway that they go through?
Okay, so there's been a number of different frameworks, I guess you could call them, proposed by different researchers that try and unpack the learning process. This is particularly, I think it's really helpful to think about adoption as a learning intensive process. There's a lot of learning goes on. And so just a typical sort of setup is the idea that there's an awareness phase. There's a point where farmers become aware that there's a new practice, a new opportunity, or a new challenge that they've got to meet, that they need to change in some way. Then if they decide that they're going to act on that, then they probably, in most cases, go into a stage of non-trial evaluation. So they're looking around, trying to find out about this practice, collecting information from neighbours and peers and maybe from extension agents, but they're not doing it yet, they're not trialling it. At that point, they might decide, yes, this is looking promising, I'll proceed to a trial. Not everything involves a trial, but it's a pretty common sort of step in the process that farmers will try stuff on a small scale for a short period and see how it goes on their property. If that turns out to be good, then they'll proceed to adoption or some sort, some scale of adoption. It's not the end of the story usually, though. In most cases, they'll then continue on to review what's happening. They'll look at the results that they're getting. They may make adjustments. In many cases, they will make adjustments to how they're doing it, where they're doing it, when they're doing it, as they get more experience with it and work out, is this working for me or not? And how's it working? What do I need to fix? And then eventually, most practices become redundant at some point, either because they're replaced by something better, or maybe the market turns against them. They depend on particular price of a particular product to be worth doing, and the price falls or something like that. And so you can get disadoption or adoption ceasing for that practice for one reason or another. So there's you can sort of see a nice sequence. It may or may not occur in that nice smooth way, but most of those elements are present for most innovations if you look at them over a long enough time frame.
And do you think farmers are sort of aware of that process? Is that conscious for them?
I think that they are quite consciously active in those things. They may not, when I describe it like that, it sounds like there's a point where you say, okay, I'm no longer trialing, I'm now adopting.
I'm moving
but it's
from
not
this one to
really
this
like
one.
that, of course. There's grey, there's fuzzy areas through all of that, and farmers, I think they're quite actively thinking about what they're doing in each of those phases. They're engaged with that process, but they're probably not conscious of it as a process like I just described. I think it's just what they do. They're probably thinking about learning and making decisions rather than thinking about it as a sort of a 5 or 6 step process like that.
It reminds me of the frustration that I have when, surveys will ask farmers, what made you make this change? And they might say, oh, it was my agronomist, but it sort of lose, particularly in that, non-trial evaluation stage that, well, I read an article and, I asked my neighbour and, it's not
there
just
are many
one
potential
thing that
triggers along the way.
So,
and it all, I think in the end, it all becomes part of one big amorphous process where there might be something that stands out as the final trigger that made the difference, but actually there's probably a whole lot of steps along the way that were important.
Excellent. All right, so that's the process. That's the steps that we go through. Can we talk about now what the different factors are that influence adoption?
Sure. So, I mentioned that there are thousands of studies, and most of those studies take the form of a snapshot. They look at a particular practice that's sort of partway through the adoption process, or maybe it's finished, and then they correlate the level of adoption amongst different farmers or between different regions with a bunch of variables. So those variables, they're trying to understand, okay, what are the factors that have caused adoption to happen for some people or not for others, or for it to be in some regions or not others. And the variety of factors that have been found to be correlated with adoption is really astounding. It's absolutely enormous. And so in one of the review papers that I published, we tried to break it down into groups to sort of start to make sense of it. And it's obviously it's quite simplified, but I'd break it down into 3 broad groups. One is issues around how easy it is to learn about the practice. So I call that trialability, because usually there's a trialing process involved. And so that's about how easy is it to get over the learning hump. Some things it's easy to learn about. They're very obvious. It's very clear. You're observing the yields that you get. It's above ground. Maybe it's a very distinctive. I'm thinking of something like canola. When canola's been grown, it's a distinctive crop. It's obviously different to what was happening before if you hadn't done it before. Maybe it's new in your region, going back decades now. And so it really stands out. Everyone would say, oh, that's a new thing. I better ask my friend about that, or, they're tuned into finding out more about it. So something like that is very obvious and very likely to trigger people to learn more. Whereas other things that might not be so visible, like things that are going on under the ground, if you're monitoring aspects of your soil quality or soil salinity or something, then it's much less obvious and might actually be harder to observe. You've got to actually take, steps to record something. So there's that aspect, the observability and the trialability. Then there's what the researchers call the relative advantage, which just means if you did this practice and you did it reasonably well, would it work for you? How well would it perform on your farm in your conditions? So that's the second thing. And there's a bunch of factors in that. Yeah. Lots of things can influence that, which we could unpack if you like. And then the third one is the social factors, sort of social, cultural, networking, and I'd probably put extension in there. It's sort of part of that. sharing of information amongst people that influences. We're all humans. We all respond to other people, and so that's my third group. Of course, a lot of the information that's talked about in that third category would relate to the first two, but I think it's worth thinking about as a separate category, because there's things going on there that are a bit different.
Absolutely. And that's the canola example, I suppose, is that if you're seeing everybody else around you adopting canola, that might encourage you to pick it up more quickly, regardless of, sort of what you've done elsewhere. So perfect. All right. So we've got the 3 factors and we've got the stages of adoption. The 3 factors are going to have different influences depending on the stage of adoption. So I'm going to get you to talk us through what's more important when, and you've prepared an excellent slide to illustrate this, which I'm going to pop up now.
All right, so this is stylized. Okay, I wouldn't claim that this is very precise. This is an attempt to pull together understanding across a range of different case studies to give sort of a broad indication of how this might work. But I think there is something going on here that's worth trying to capture. So you can see in the slide, I've got the 3 different factors in the different columns: the social factors, the relative advantage, and the trialability. And down the left-hand side, I've got the different stages that we talked about, from awareness through to disadoption. And the stars, the number of stars, 1, 2, or 3, or none, is meant to indicate, broadly speaking, how influential is this group of factors at those different stages. And what's the research told us about which of the factors is most likely to make a difference in moving through that stage to the next stage. And you can see, and I've put these red boxes around the 3 stars just to highlight those ones. You can see for the social factors, of course, they're influential at every stage, but they're especially influential at the early stages of awareness raising and non-trial evaluation. They're less decisive in the final adoption decision. And I think you can easily understand why that would be. Once a farmer has experience with a particular practice and has grown it on their own property, they've observed its performance, that's going to be the primary influence on their decision about whether they keep doing it, rather than what someone said about how it would perform back in the day. It's not saying that the social factors won't still be influential, but the relative advantage will become the most important factor. So relative advantage is, as I've indicated there, decisive in the adoption, revision, disadoption, so the later phases in the process. It's still influential in the earlier phases, like it's part of the non-trial evaluation phase. You're trying to work out what the relative advantage will be, of course. So it figures there too. And then the trialability, of course, it's in the name, is most relevant to the stage where a practice is being trialled, and probably also in the non-trial evaluation stage. So it's quite interesting, I think, that these different factors are sort of complementary in a way. They sort of come out as being most important at different stages. They all overlap, but they have relatively high influence at different parts of the process.
David, I'm interested that there's sort of no star in the relative advantage and awareness stage. I think that sort of when we tend to go out and try to give information to farmers is that when they're at that awareness stage, is we want to tell them this is the benefit, this is what you'll get out of it. Why might that not be? I
probably need to explain what I mean by that awareness stage. So at that point, in what you just described, I would say we're into the non-trial evaluation stage. If anyone's listening to that, then they're in the non-trial evaluation stage. Awareness is as simple as, do you know that this practice even exists? Have you even heard of it? And there was some very interesting research done a while back now, some decades ago, looking at farmers were given notebooks and asked to record when they became aware of the existence of a new practice. And one of the findings from that was interesting to me was that there was, in some cases, there were quite long time delays between the point when the practice became available and it had been extended before farmers started to twig that this thing even existed. So farmers are busy. They've got many things being put to them. They're flooded with information, and ideas, and so just like all of us, we're good at shutting off stuff unless somehow it gets through our barriers and thinks, oh yeah, that's relevant to me. And so that's what I mean by that sort of initial awareness.
So whether they know about it or not. But even then, once you get to the trial evaluation, that relative advantage is still only got that 1 star there. So it's less important than we might think instead of going out and saying, here is everything that you'll get by adopting this, that really that social element is what's far more important.
Of course, you need to be convinced that the relative advantage will be high enough to be worth progressing through to trials or adoption. So it's in there. But it's just the fact that there's 3 stars under the social is just sort of indicating, well, where are you getting your information from? Well, you're not getting it from a trial or your farm because you're not trialing it, right? You're getting it from neighbours and extension agents and whatever.
Excellent. And now just to sort of wrap up our 101, it's important to understand both the innovation, so the practice that you're wanting adopted, but also who's going to be adopting it. So why is that important?
This is one of my I guess a pet peeve, you could call it. When I look at...
Good, we want to hear about what we do wrong.
It's not so much you doing wrong, it's probably the people doing research on adoption doing it wrong, in the sense that many studies focus on one or the other and neglect the other. There's a lot of studies, particularly I'd say in the sort of the sociological sort of side, some in the extension sort of side, that focus very much on the people. And, you can understand that they're people-oriented researchers, but don't give enough attention to the actual practice itself, whether it will work for those farmers. And then you've got others that really focus primarily on the practice, maybe that's economists a bit in some situations, and don't think enough about the complexities of the social and the human side. But the research is really compelling but they both matter, that you can't really fully understand what's going on if you don't try and, if you putting it simply, adoption is really about matching them up, right? It's about finding a situation where a particular practice works for a particular group of farmers. So if you don't understand both, then you can't even talk sensibly about that, right? So, for example, let's say one of the factors that influences adoption is risk, right? There's lots of evidence that risk is an important factor, but there's 2 sides to that. There's the issue of how much does this particular population of farmers care about risk? Some farmers are highly risk averse. Some farmers are not that risk averse. There's a small number that are actually risk seeking, right? So you've got to know that. And then on the other hand, well, is this practice that we're sort of thinking about promoting to farmers or is being considered by the farmers, is that a risky practice? So that you've got to, those 2 things have to come together before you can say, oh, okay, it's a highly risky practice, but these farmers are not that risk averse, so it doesn't actually matter that it's highly risky, right? So you've got to put the 2 parts into the story to say, oh, okay, this is what it means for adoption.
Excellent. And it means being, narrowing down a target audience a bit as well too, and not just saying all farmers.
Being clear about the target audience and being clear about what the practice is too, yes.
Excellent. All right. So today we're giving our audience some practical tips on how to design their RD&E efforts with farmer adoption in mind. What do you think should be the very first step?
Think about adoption. So I don't want to tell people how to suck eggs. I think there's a bunch of good extension practice, obvious extension practice stuff that anyone engaged in extension knows is important and has to worry about. So, relationships, trust, credibility, persistence, all those things are quality of communication, right? So there's all those things. But from an adoption point of view, I guess what I would highlight is the need to think about adoption very early. So let's talk about 2 things here. Let's talk about thinking about the adoptability of the practice before you choose to extend it, right? So actually make some judgments or do some analysis, do something, collect some information to help think about whether this particular practice could ever be adopted by this group of farmers. Take that question seriously early on in the process. looking down the years of the many extension campaigns that I've been part of or been witness to, some work very successfully, some fail dismally, and the ones that fail dismally, you often could have predicted that. You could have, with a bit of thoughtfulness, a bit of information collection, you could have understood that this was never going to fly, and you can save a lot of heartache and time and effort by worrying about that early in the process. So that's my first one. And then the second one is sort of, you mentioned targeting a bit earlier on. It's about I think it's about targeting the type of information that might be most useful or most effective. So if you've done that first part and you've said, yeah, look, I'm pretty confident this is a practice that has high relative advantage for the group of farmers that I deal with, should be adoptable. Well, what's going to make the difference? Rick Llewellyn in CSIRO in Adelaide did a fantastic paper a few years ago now, but I think it's 2008, on the question of targeting extension to particular types of information. And he identified, it sounds like common sense, but I haven't seen this written anywhere else, right? There's two parts to this. There is, what do the farmers not already know, right? There's not a lot of point in extending stuff that's already well known to them, and sometimes we do a lot of that. But then, of the things they don't know, which ones are going to make the biggest difference to their decision to adopt? Now, that could be a bit more difficult to anticipate, I think. I think you can probably get some hints about what farmers do and don't know by talking to them, or some other processes, which we might talk about later. But the one about, well, which one will make the most difference, a bit more tricky. But we're going to talk about adopt later, so that will be one way that you might be able to get at that.
Perfect. And just a little laugh in the background, David, when we were prepping earlier before we started today, I was saying, look, don't stress. Last time we had, last webinar I did, the guest's smoke alarm went off. I live near a fire station, and if you just heard that siren before, yeah, it's because there's obviously a fire and the siren has gone. So thankfully you spoke just enough time for them to get a truck out the door. So that was beautifully planned. So thank you for that. So I said, as long as we don't have a smoke alarm go off, but no, we've still had a fire alarm go off. So that was all good. Now, David, I heard you present at a workshop in Perth a couple of months ago now, and you talked about an adoption mindset. What's an adoption mindset?
So I think an adoption mindset is, well, it's sort of like what we've been saying, right? It's right from the early stages of, well, extension planning, but also research planning, research and development planning, and policy planning, taking the adoption questions seriously, asking, working out how you're going to tackle those questions right from the start. Who is this adoptable? Who would adopt it? How much would they adopt it? How quickly are they likely to adopt it? What would it take to get them to adopt it? It's those sort of obvious questions that we often don't ask until the adoption has failed. There we go again. Until the adoption hasn't worked. It's often, as an economist, I'm used to being drawn into processes, into sort of projects towards the end, and people are saying, well, we can't get anyone to adopt it. And you look at it and say, yeah, because it's not economic. But it's too late. The research has happened. So yeah, doing it early, and just putting adoption front and center. Now, obviously adoption isn't the whole story. There's a lot in this. It's really about, maybe it's not even an adoption mindset. It's an impact mindset, right? It's what I'm doing to make a difference. What can I do to make sure that what I do will make a difference in the world? And a significant part of that in an agricultural research extension policy context is, will farmers adopt what I'm interested in here? So it's in that broader context of impact.
Perfect. And so in order to do that thinking that you've mentioned, do we need a bit more time up front to be able to do that? Like, what do we need? How can we go back to the organisations that we work with to go, hey, how can we think about this more deeply?
That can be a challenge, obviously. organisations can be quite impatient, or there can just be deadlines that are out of your control that yeah, and even funding. You know, if the extension you're doing is part of a particular project, you know, is the resourcing sufficient to allow this what not exactly an upfront process, but an early process that may extend the life of the project potentially. So that's the downside, I guess. The upside is, well, it might make it work. You know, so I think there's plenty to sell, right? There's plenty of upside to help market or sell the idea that this is worth taking the time and potentially the resources to do. I don't think that the resources necessarily need to be huge. I think it's quite. I have been involved in processes where they were very thorough, right? So this upfront evaluation process has been very comprehensive, and that has taken some time, you know, months, but it needn't necessarily be. I think that compared to not doing it at all, there's significant value in doing a bit of it. So even if there is pressure or lack of resources, I would still strongly encourage, you know, taking it seriously to the extent that it's possible.
Perfect. All right. So we've talked about, you know, taking those first steps. It's better to do something than nothing. You've given us a couple of key questions that we should be asking, both about the innovation itself and the audience. What are some of the tools that we can use to help us with this if we get the time and the scope and the resources to be able to do this work?
I'm going to talk about Adopt as the tool. So the team of people and other collaborators that I've worked with around Australia on adoption got together. It started as part of a CRC, a Cooperative Research Centre, back in the mid-noughties, where we were working. The CRC had asked us, we'd really like you to do some research on adoption. And we came back to them and said, well, actually, we don't think that's the priority, even though we were adoption researchers. We think you'd get more value if we put some really serious work into sort of synthesizing what we know and trying to package it. So we initially did quite a comprehensive review of the research that's out there and presented that, and that was useful. And it led to a whole bunch of things. It led to some national workshops and some videos and stuff. But then we realized that there was a sort of a gap. There was a gap in the tool space, right? So you ask, what's the tool? If you'd asked me that in 2005, I would have had to say, I don't think there are any, or at least not to answer the sort of questions that I've been talking about today. Of course, there are tools around extension and adoption, but specifically to try and answer those questions, how many farmers will adopt this? Who will adopt it? What will influence the adoption? There wasn't much. And so we set out to try to create a tool that would do that. And there was a team, a multidisciplinary national team across multiple states and multiple agencies that got together to do this. And we produced a tool that many people will have heard of called Adopt, the Adoption and Diffusion Outcome Prediction Tool, which it sounds like a pretty simple job of what it's trying to do. It's trying to predict the peak level of adoption for a particular practice for a particular group of farmers, what proportion of farmers will ever adopt it, and the time that it will take. You know, will that happen in 5 years or 30 years sort of thing. So it does that. It's based on a series of questions. There are 22 different variables that we've identified as being really key, and they range across a whole variety of different things. There's variables that relate to the adopters, the farmers, and the practice. There are variables that relate to the learning process and the relative advantage. So it's a 2x2 sort of grid, if you like, and there's questions that relate to all combinations of those factors. I'm not going to run through them all.
I've got an example of one that I can pop up so that people can see it, David. I've also got a poll question that I'll pop up as well too about people's familiarity with Adopt. So I'm just going to share that now.
That shows a simple question. We've tried to make this pretty simple to what extent is the use of the innovation likely to affect the profitability of the farm business in the year that it's used? Obviously, that's an important factor. And the answers to the questions are often on a 5-point scale. Actually, that one's on more than 5. I think it's 7 or 8. But most of the questions, how risky is this practice? Not risky at all through to extremely risky, and on 5 steps is the sort of the style. So it's not that we expect very precise answers. The value comes in considering this quite a diverse range of issues that are relevant and stitching them together to come up with an overall prediction of adoption. It's not just, I gave a talk on Adopt a couple of days ago, and people were asking me, or one person was asking me, well, what are the weights on the different factors? It's not just a matter of weights, right? It's actually, there are functions in there that with relationships between the variables. So the different variables interact in sometimes quite complex ways. They have weights, but the weights are sort of quite deeply buried in the system because, we've tried to represent the adoption process in quite a lot of detail. If you're interested in understanding the general shape of it, you can read about it. There's various publications where that's available. So that's Adopt, right? And so I'm looking at the poll results. We've got never heard of it, aware of it, use it occasionally, use it often, use it all the time. Okay, so not many intensive users, but more than half have used it. Is that right? Or no, perhaps not quite half. Anyway, it's out there. It is widely used. We've got, I haven't kept up with the numbers, but it's probably something like 1,500 different users. It's free. There's a free version available online to use. If you're interested, go and explore adopt.csiro.au. Quite a lot of international use, interestingly. It's calibrated on Australian data. Our validation shows that, as best we can tell, it seems to work quite well in predicting adoption. Once you're clear about who the adopters are and what the practice is, we get pretty good predictions. And interestingly, the international users also think that it gives them fairly good predictions as well, which we didn't really anticipate. I'm not really sure how true that is, but at least it's giving them some value, right? It's leading them through a process of talking about the adoption process, asking a series of important questions about how much adoption there will be and what factors will influence it, and then coming up with some numbers at the end. But we do find that the actual process of considering all of these questions is also very valuable. In some ways, just as valuable as the actual prediction at the end.
Perfect. Quick question from Rachel. Is there any geographical boundary issues?
Not so much geographical, but possibly type of agriculture. So it's been calibrated on data from commercial scale agriculture, right? So a variety of different types of agriculture, but it's not hobby farmers. It's not horticulture, although it's actually been used in horticulture reasonably well, I think. And it's not really smallholder international farmers, but we do have another version. So we had some requests to develop a smallholder version for developing countries, and so we did that. And that is a bit different. It has some different variables in there because there's different factors that influence adoption in a sort of a farmer that has a half a hectare or a hectare of land is a different prospect and is facing quite different challenges in many cases than someone with 1,000 hectares. So there's a different version for them. But from an Australian or a developing country audience, it's more about, is this a commercial enterprise or something less than that?
I'd love to hear from the people who are using it. If they want to pop in the chat how they use Adopt, that'd be fantastic to see some of the examples. I know some people who use it really effectively, with a bunch of farmers. So actually, you pulling the levers. I use it a fair bit in terms of understanding what are going to be some of the key levers for particular extension approaches that I might be looking at. I also like to use it in grant writing and reporting, particularly if I might be working with an agency who isn't really close to agriculture and might not appreciate how long things change. There's nothing worse than being told, oh, here's a 2-year extension program and we want to see 80% uptake by the end of it. So I use Adopt to sort of go, look, realistically, this is where I think we could get to help manage some expectations.
Well, they're fantastic comments, Prue, and they highlight that there's different uses and there's also different modes of use. Like one, in that last couple of cases, I guess you were doing it yourself. It's relatively quick, right? You're just doing it at home on the desktop or in the office on the desktop, and it's a sort of an initial exploration. You could view it that way. It's a sort of a, what can I learn from Adopt that will help me start to think about these issues. Another mode of use, as you've highlighted, is sort of working with a group of farmers to get them to start to, well, partly they could be helping you understand the adoption issues and talking them through because you're asking them a set of questions that are prompted by Adopt. Another mode of use that we've used is working with a group of extension research specialists to get them to provide the answers. And that's partly about helping them come to terms with the issues. But it's also, if we want to make the best possible predictions, that's probably the mode of use that I would go to, maybe with some farmer consultation as well. And then the other one is sort of like in a larger group, like a bigger workshop, which is probably in most cases sort of more an educational role than trying to make predictions. It's more like awareness raising about the issues and awareness raising about Adopt, perhaps. Having those discussions more than getting the best possible prediction. Having some good arguments.
Perfect. Well, that's Brendan's just made a similar comment. It's been very useful over the years in opening discussions around expectations, not just about the numbers, but about getting the discussion realistic on adoption expectations. All right. Let's move into some case studies now, because we love case studies here at Expanded Horizons. We want to see the real world applications of this stuff. And let's start with the big one. What did you find were the key factors that influenced farmer adoption of no-till in Australia?
Okay, so you saw me present a talk that touched on this, as you mentioned a couple of months ago. I was actually quoting other research, actually research I didn't do myself, some colleagues. In fact, I mentioned Rick Llewellyn earlier. He was one of the authors on this paper, along with Frank Demden and a couple of others. So there's actually been a number of studies that have looked at no-till adoption in different parts, in not just of Australia, but around the world. The example I'll mention is the West Australian one, but it's not atypical of findings in other places. And it's a really nice one because it throws up a few quite important insights. So, for example, well, I guess one of the high-level insights is that, within Adopt, we're talking about some relatively generic factors. We try and get quite precise as far as we can, but what the study of individual practices often throws up is that there's something a bit from left field that's very specific to that practice that influences the generic factors, but is, you've got to look in depth. So, for example, in the case of no-till in Western Australia, we found the sort of the usual generic factors: education, participation in extension around no-till, the use of a paid consultant, the presence of someone else nearby who had already adopted it. We're going right back to the early days of adoption of no-till here. So those were important factors. But then there was a group of factors that influenced, I guess what they were doing is influencing the relative advantage. These are sort of underpinning the relative advantage of no-till as a practice. So again, remembering this is back in the early days, there was a fall in the price of glyphosate. When it first came out, glyphosate was under patent and it was really expensive. When it went off patent, the price really plummeted. And that in itself helped to promote the uptake no-till in those early days. The occurrence of a very dry year because of moisture conservation under no-till. The recent rainfall, the effectiveness of a particular pre-emergent herbicide, trifluralin, was seen as an alternative back in those days, or was one of the elements of a package back in those days. And whether farmers were concerned about the timeliness of seeding or how important they considered that to be, because no-till helps you to seed earlier. So there was a bunch of factors, some of which were, as you can see from what I've said then, quite specific to no-till. You wouldn't find those factors emerging amongst, a weed management thing, or well, glyphosate would, but some of those others wouldn't so much. So that was one of the lessons, this mix of generic and specific factors, although even those specific factors underpin a broader generic one around relative advantage. One of the other interesting things, though, that came out of this particular study was that there were some factors that we had anticipated, or the authors had anticipated were important, that didn't turn out to be so important. One of those was erosion risk, or membership of a land conservation group, or perceived soil conservation benefits, which was pretty surprising since we're talking about no-till here, right? So easily the most important soil conservation practice that's ever been adopted in Australia, and yet soil conservation was there, but it really wasn't one of the top group of factors that was influencing whether adoption occurred. So that, the message there was that adoption might not be for the reason that you think you're promoting the practice. Be aware of other possible inhibitors or promoters of the practice that might be of more concern to farmers than was the reason that the researchers or whoever started to say, well, this is a good idea.
Perfect. And you mentioned in your introduction your role with lupins in WA. Can you give us an example about how the influence of extension on adoption in that particular case?
That was an interesting case study, because although there's been a lot of research on adoption, and there's been a lot of research on extension, there hasn't been much research about the influence of extension on adoption. So we thought, oh, this is great, we'll have a go. But we soon worked out why there hasn't been so much. It's really hard. It's very difficult to find a circumstance where it's practical and easy to do that. Often, particularly if you come in at the end of an extension campaign, if you're looking back, it's quite difficult to get information about how much extension occurred, where it occurred, how much it was costing, and so on, which we were trying to do as part of this process. So there was a natural experiment with lupins in Western Australia, because this is a practice that was quite widely adopted. At its peak, there was about 1 million hectares a year being planted of lupins, particularly on our sandier soils. But it started in the north of the wheat belt and then headed south. So there was extension, and initially the thought was it would primarily be grown in the north, but its role expanded as the farming systems benefits became better understood. So there was a lot of extension in the north, and then over time, as years passed, the extension steadily picked up in further southern regions. So what we did was we broke down the wheat belt into shires and did estimates of the level of extension in each shire or in neighbouring shires, and tried to understand adoption over time and how much influence adoption in the shire or near the shire had on adoption. So long story short, what we found was that extension did have a measurable influence on the adoption, and that the cost of the extension was easily less than the benefits. That was very much worthwhile. It was a very financially, if you just valued it in terms of the benefits to farmers versus the cost of the extension campaign, very attractive. But interestingly, we got that result even though the influence of extension was primarily on moving the level of adoption forward by a couple of years, not primarily by increasing the long-term level of adoption. If you looked at the level of adoption at any particular year, then it was higher if there had been extension. But if you looked at the end point, the end game, the peak level of adoption, that wasn't so much influenced by extension. It was influenced by the other factors that I mentioned, the factors that underpin relative advantage. So that was a really interesting study that showed, okay, extension very much worthwhile, but we need to have realistic expectations about what it can achieve. The practice needs to be adoptable. It needs to have higher relative advantage. And what the extension in that example was doing was just bringing adoption forward rather than increasing dramatically the final level.
Perfect. And we've got one more case study before we go into some questions. We've already got a couple on the side there. Bonus points if you can work in a Beatles quote with your question, which is happening, which is fantastic. The last case study, which we can quickly skim over, a really nice analysis. We're going to change sector and we're going to change countries as well too. A nice analysis on adoption pathways for the use of body condition scoring among pastoral farmers in New Zealand. And I've got some really beautiful slides that you've prepared to illustrate this.
Can we go to the other one? That one. Let's start with that one.
That one.
So this was work by a PhD student of mine, Oscar Montes, which has been published. You can see the citation down the bottom there. It's just a really lovely way of understanding some of the diversity and heterogeneity in the farming population at a particular point in time in terms of their adoption of a particular practice. So I really like the way this is depicted and the understanding that it draws out. So what we've got there is, on the left-hand side, the left-hand two blocks are awareness or non-awareness. So you can see 96% of these farmers were aware of this particular practice. It almost doesn't matter what it is. 4% were still not aware. Then of the ones who were aware, 45% had used this practice without trialing. Actually, I think that's relatively unusual, but what happened in this case, usually they would go into trialing. What have we got? 35% went into a trial, and then 16% were aware of it, but still had never trialed it. And then going from the ones who have trialed it, then we're looking at constant or increasing use over time, constant or decreasing use. What have we got? Use for more than 5 years or for up to 5 years, decreasing use and still trialing, or disadopting it. Right, so you can sort of see there's quite a bit of crossover there, right? There's people going from, they started using it without trialing, but then some of them disadopted it, right? But some of them have kept using it for more than 5 years, and everything in between. So it really was a great, I think, a nice sort of understanding of what's going on and the diversity of situations that farmers are in. If you had one of these diagrams for a particular case, a particular practice for a particular group of farmers, it might tell you a lot about where the opportunities are, or if there are any opportunities, right? So that's that one. If we quickly jump to the second one, that's just continuing on from that right-hand group of blocks to intentions. Where do you think you're going next? Further increase use, remain constant, maybe decrease. As another way of sort of further disentangling it and getting more intelligence about where the opportunities might be.
Beautiful. All right. We're going to duck into some questions now. So please, if you've got any, pop them in. So our first one, farmers often do not have the opportunities to trial technologies across many different years / crops / management systems. How can farmers be supported not to jump to incorrect conclusions from evaluating new technologies on the basis of a few observations? Or as John Lennon is quoted to have said, reality leaves a lot to the imagination.
I've never heard that John Lennon quote, and I've heard a lot of John Lennon quotes. Okay. I think that might have been made up. Okay, really interesting point. So, one thing I think that farmers do is that in many cases they're conscious of this as a risk, and so they don't leap to full-scale adoption. Right? What you typically see is some trialing happening. And then maybe, depending on what type of trialing it is, it might get scaled up over time. So, you've done some really small scale trials. Then it looks good, so you'll just put in a paddock. You won't go full bore. You'll just put in a small paddock of whatever it is, and see how that goes. If it's still looking good, you'll put in a couple of paddocks. So there's, the sort of trialing can sort of merge into adoption as more experience is gained and farmers get more experience. So that's sort of, in some cases, that's possible. There are other extremes where even trialing at all is not possible. And the example that has been mentioned to be would be adopting a new type of, dairy. You're going to have to either go the whole hog and invest in the new dairy system and put it in place, or you're not. You can't put in a bit of it, right? So all you can do there is, I guess, get as well informed as possible. Go and, I think this is bleeding obvious. You go and look at examples, you collect as much information as possible, and I think farmers are well aware of that. The way the question was asked, it was as if farmers need to be protected from proceeding too quickly. That's an interesting point. I guess it's not a perception that I had. It's be interesting to sort of delve into that a bit, if there's some examples where that questioner feels that might have happened. Of course, people do go into things and then go out. Lupins was a great example, right? The initial adoption of lupins before the period when we were studying it was unsuccessful. There was quite wide adoption for a while, but then it crashed and burned because of disease. And I guess that would have been hard to anticipate, right? It was a matter of, we've got to try this and see what happens. Sometimes you just can't tell until it's been adopted to some degree, and something like disease would be a good case where disease wouldn't become very widespread until there was a fair bit of adoption. And then you find out, okay, this is a problem. And actually they had to go back and revisit the research and try and create some disease resistance. I don't know if I've fully answered that question. I've danced around it a bit, but there's some thoughts in there that relate to it.
Perfect. Look, we'll try and get through the rest of the questions that are coming through, just so that we can finish on time. While we do that, though, we always do like to finish these with a little bit of a show and tell, recognizing that we can't learn everything in 1 hour of your time, David. So I'm going to pop up a link to David's blog and also a couple of slides on some resources that David suggested for further reading while we go through these last couple of questions. How can you be sure that a farmer has adopted and is not trialing?
I don't think you can. I don't think there's a clean boundary between them. I think it's, as I've sort of indicated, it's often a transition. And the way that I described it, there's trialing, then there's adoption, and then there's, monitoring and revision over time. Even in the revision phase, they're still learning, right? In a way, it's still trialing. So yeah, I don't think you can.
Perfect. Now we're going to have to be rapid fire for the last couple of questions. Can you speak to the role that local influential producers have on adoption broadly, and or as influencers of adoption?
Of course they do. Of course, influential farmers, and particularly, iconic extension professionals as well, have a disproportionate influence. That's been plenty of studies, plenty of research, and plenty of anecdotal evidence that's the case. Quick and dirty, quick response, since we're trying to get through a few.
Perfect. What tips can you share about good data in to adopt for good info out, i.e. manage the rubbish, the risk of rubbish in, rubbish out?
Well, as I sort of flagged, there's different modes of use, and in some cases you might accept that it's quick and dirty, and you're just learning something, as Prue described the process. Some of the processes that she's doing is just exploring, and so your best guesses at the moment might be enough for that purpose. So I really think it's about horses for courses. If you actually want to make predictions that you think you're going to rely on, then I think it's about the protection in that is about the process that you go through. It's about, okay, I'm serious about this. I'm going to consult a group of experts that will help me get the best answers to these 22 questions that I can. And it probably means quite a diverse group of experts, people that know about the farmers, people that sort of are farming systems oriented, people that know about the innovation that the particular practice that you're interested in, maybe people with some economics background, so a diversity of people that can come together and complement each other to answer the questions.
We are out of time. Sorry, I know there's a couple of questions in there that we haven't had a chance to get to, but we do need to finish on time. David, I could keep talking to you all day. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you very much to our audience for joining in. We hope that this has stimulated your thinking and given you some useful tips and tools to help you in your practice, and best of luck in cultivating your impact mindset. I've just popped up the registration for our November webinar on the screen, and in this one we're going to be diving into the role of private sector extension with Tony Craddock. He is the Manager of Pinion Advisory's Ag Production and Adoption Services area, and he specialises in farm business management, agronomy and extension services across South Australia's cropping zones. In this webinar, Tony is going to share his reflections and experiences on how the role that advisors have in extension is changing and where he sees the future, what emerging areas are farmers looking for their advisor to support them in. And I had a fascinating conversation with Tony recently that he's got lots of clients wanting help, particularly in climate, carbon emission spaces, and he's got some great insights into how agronomists can be supported in that space. What are the extension gaps? Obviously, advisors aren't going to be able to do everything, so what are they not picking up and why? And the challenges that advisors face in delivering extension and what support they need. I hope that I'll see you all at that next month. Once this webinar finishes, you'll be directed to a survey link. It would be very much appreciated if you could please fill this out. I know nobody likes them, but it shouldn't take any more than a minute, and I do take any advice, suggestions on topics or people that I should be talking to very seriously for future episodes of this webinar. Thank you again for participating in today's Expanded Horizons webinar, delivered by the Southern New South Wales Drought Resilience Adoption and Innovation Hub. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.